When Apple officially announced macOS 10 25 years ago, it changed the course of history for the company. On this episode of the Macworld Podcast, we'll look at the history of macOS 10, the effect it had on the company, and what we expect in the future. Stick around. This should be a good one. Welcome to the Macworld Podcast. I'm Roman Loyola here with Jason Cross.
Good morning.
And Michael Simon.
Hello, sir.
And before we continue, we would like to apologize to our listeners because we're all either under the weather or recovering from being under the weather. So we're doing our best here.
We sound funny.
Yeah,
we all sound funny, and we're going to all cough and sniffle a lot during the show. And as Jason said before the show, AI needs to create a filter to fix all that in production. So
yeah, just automatically remove all your little sniffles and coughs and stuff.
yes,
That'd be great.
Yes. Anyways, on January 5th, 2000, at a little event called Macworld Expo, remember that? Those were the good old days. Steve Jobs took the stage.
Remember when we used to have to I'm sorry, I'm already off the rails.
That's all right. Go for it.
We used to have to go to ours is probably one of them that had live blogs that would run.
Oh yeah.
Right.
A couple of seconds or maybe a minute behind what was actually happening because there was no video until days after the event, maybe not at all. And news would trickle out the new operating system or whatever it is, and it would reverberate around the internet. Now it's just a press release and everybody knows immediately and we can watch it live.
Yeah.
But it was so different back then.
You go to a site where you're waiting for it to begin. Like the site's already up with a little looping video saying when the thing's coming. Yeah, I remember I had my DSLR tethered to my laptop and doing tethered shooting with an automation for Aperture, good old Aperture, to take images, resize them down, put our watermark on them, and dump them all into and send them all to people back doing the live blog, so you could type something and I could just take pictures and they would get resized and watermarked and then send it to people to use. It was wow, what a totally different world.
Yeah, on January 5th was the official announcement of macOS 10.
macOS 10, they actually called it macOS 10. Yeah, the first time they named it that, yeah.
With an X. It actually didn't ship for another year. And Apple had kind of shown it unofficially before Expo.
Bits and pieces. We didn't get to look at the whole thing in operation. We knew some new, radical new operating system was coming. We knew that from the start. So Apple bought Next, which was Steve Jobs' company, to get the OS. And him, obviously.
And Jobs took him back in.
But the OS... which was called BB something.
Next Step.
What was it? It was based on something, but whatever. Yeah. So they wanted to bring Mac OS 8 and 9 into the future. It was obvious that it was clunky and outdated and old, and they had this project called Copland that went nowhere, and they needed some kind of a foundation and. They found it in Next, and they also brought back Steve Jobs, which was, not a bad thing to do as well.
Yeah. Kind of a side note, there was some rumblings before the Next acquisition that Apple was considering acquiring BOS.
Oh, that's what I'm talking about.
Yep.
Yes, that's what you were talking about, which was Jean-Louis Gasset's project. So it was kind of between those two. And
another old Apple guy, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Maybe it's in some book somewhere. I don't remember. I don't know how serious Apple was thinking about adopting BOS.
I think it was one of those things that you say you're doing and you make some moves and you hold some meetings just to secure a better deal from the one you really want.
A leverage move. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a leverage move. But it wasn't quite as complete as it needed to be. But if you've ever used it, it was really neat for its time. Yeah. It was a lot like it felt a lot like using the Amiga was. Like, you'd be like, wow, it could do that. Like, and there were a lot of things that in retrospect were just so far ahead of their time and done on extremely limited resources, like really, really weak computers compared to the day, right? So, yeah, BOS was pretty cool.
But Apple went ahead and did the deal with Next and incorporated Next Step. And there's a whole huge story about the integration of Next and the Mac and everything, and there are books about it. And we're not going to go over that history here because it's long and complicated. And
I thought one of their most interesting moves was going with the Roman numeral 10. Yep. They were coming off, I think Mac OS 9.2 was the last release.
Yeah, right. 9.2.
So it was obvious to go Mac OS 10, right? But because they chose the Roman numeral X, and because that was the first thing a lot of people experienced, like there were a lot of people who got an iMac and stuff like after that. There were just like this whole generation of people who call it Mac OS X.
Yeah, sure.
And it didn't help that they didn't quickly, like next year, go Mac OS 11 and then Mac OS 12.
It took another 10 years to get to.
Right. They would like 10, Mac OS 10.
Like every 2.3, etc.
Yeah, they made major releases, point releases, and kept that Roman numeral. And the way people refer to Mac OS to this day, a lot of people still say Mac OS X when talking about old Mac OS.
Did you guys have any experience with that first version of Mac OS 10? At that time, I was working at a startup, hoping to make my big bucks, because that was the time when startups were big and people were making a lot of money, and I was kind of hoping I would do the same thing, and that didn't work out. So I wasn't at a Mac publication at the time, so I didn't have direct access to those early versions of Mac OS 10. Do you guys have any recollections about that at all?
I don't think I used what was the original 10.0 version launched in like March of 2001. It took a couple of minor updates. Like the next few months, they had a 10.0.1, .2, .3. I don't think I used it until, God, when did those first iMacs come out?
Yeah, I didn't use it till it was officially released, so I didn't get to. I didn't see any pre-release versions, because there were a lot of changes that happened between the announcement, the public beta, and the official release. There were a lot of changes that happened.
The first one I used was the 10.0. Like the full version. I remember going to CompUSA, which was a computer store back then, and buying a copy for, I think it was $30 or $20. I don't remember the disc. I did not have the beta. The beta was available. It was a public beta in September, available on Apple's for download. But I don't even think I had like internet access back then to get it. Like, I think I must have, but like I didn't know.
It was on CDs.
Yeah.
And then it came out, and I honestly am not sure if I used that or if my first dip with it was 10.1 the next year, which was a huge improvement.
10.0, 10.1 was a big one. 10.2 was even bigger.
Yeah.
But 10.0, like, it was, a ridiculous change. I remember I had a Power Mac G4. I think the Quicksilver one, either the Quicksilver one or the one right before that. I don't remember exactly, but like when you loaded it, first of all, it didn't do a lot of stuff. Like there were a lot of missing. It didn't have like a DVD drive, like or a DVD app. Like there were a lot of things it didn't do, but you could tell just by firing it up, like, wow, this is extraordinarily different, not just from OS 9, but from anything that was out there. Windows, what was it? Windows 2000, I guess, or Windows Vista. 2000, whatever was available at the time.
Yeah.
It was very different than anything that had been available on any PC out there.
Yeah, I remember when I first saw the dock and thinking that it was a revelation, and then also thinking, why hasn't any other computer had this in the first place? But also thinking how cool it was, and mostly because of the animation, because it you can scroll across it and it would do the thing where the icons got bigger and
hold down the shift button and it would go down and thing.
Yeah,
it was remarkable. There's no other word for it. Like, it was really like a mind-blowing moment, kind of like when you got your first iPhone. It was like, wow, this thing is clearly the future of what's happening. And you had to deal with a lot of bumps in those early days. For one, like, software didn't run. You had to go into a whole nother emulation environment. Rosetta at the time wasn't just like, it wasn't what it is now with Apple Silicon, where things just worked in the background. Like, you had to go into, like, really basically boot up OS 9 on a separate virtualization thing to run a lot of apps, including like Photoshop and stuff. Like, a lot.
Not even virtualization. It was just dual booting. You just basically shut down your Mac OS 10 and reloaded Mac OS 9 to run stuff. Yeah, it was. I remember doing that on the old Blueberry iMac, the thing. I remember that being a thing. I remember the Quake 3 Arena beta test coming to Mac first, and that being a big deal, and everybody being upset about that, and John Carmack going, "No, it's not that the Mac's better. It's just we need the test to be small. There's just not as many Mac users." And they have decent OpenGL drivers. But, and that was like Mac OS 9 app. That was before Mac OS 10 came out. But I remember that all happening and coming out. I remember, and this was years after Windows 95 just blew up, right? Yeah. And 98 even. And just totally changed how Windows worked into a real, proper, preemptive multitasking.
It made it Mac-like, really. Windows 95 was kind of Mac OS for Windows at the time. The graphical user interface, the file system. It was
Windows 3.1.1 was ostensibly a lot like that, but it ran on top of DOS. So this was like a full native preemptive multitasking. It gave you the start menu, all these things. The taskbar with all your running apps, all that stuff. Like, the Mac didn't have any of that. So like their version of that was like the dock and stuff. They were like taking a lot of things that people had expected, because this thing had already blown up and hundreds of millions of copies sold. It was 5 years old by this point.
Right.
And they were looking, Microsoft was looking forward to the next thing. Apple's like, the expectations have changed. We can't build on top of Mac OS 9 to meet these things. We need a clean slate with a new, like, from the ground up, completely new operating system. What an ordeal to make that happen, to make apps work. It was nothing like today. Like today, people have it so easy. They completely changed their entire processor architecture, and for the most part, everything you have kind of worked.
Oh, it worked,
right? Yeah. Like the hoops you had to jump through to get things to work, or to get to print something or whatever when they changed these things was massive. Yeah. So, and it was a Herculean task that they did extremely well. They did better than you could have hoped. And so many of the things that Steve Jobs showed when he showed the original Mac OS 10 25 years ago are still just a part of Mac OS.
Yeah.
Like the Chrome's a little different. It's all flat now and stuff like that. But
Jason Snell wrote an article, and I was editing it over the weekend, and when you look at both the video, the Macworld Expo video, and like the screenshots, I mean, it's remarkably similar to what we have today, 25 years later. It's it's obviously different, but it's pretty damn close to what it was, and that's 25 years in commuting time is, I mean, it might as well be 17 generations. I mean, it's a tremendous amount of time. This shows you how far ahead Apple was with OS 10.
Well, I'll say yes and no, because part of it is, yeah, well, there's so many things like the way the dock works, the way your stoplights at the corner of your window to adjust things, minimizing with the little thing, the way Finder works. Like they went through some phases where they were all about the like cover flow in Finder, which still exists, but it's not like the default. That was like how you're going to look at all your stuff. But the menu bar up top, so many things are the same. So many things have changed with the way the system properties works, the control center, just like so many things are completely different. But what strikes me as very different about Apple is that they have very much stuck with it and just made every now and then they'll make a concerted change like they did with the control center or the notification slide over, and they'll stick with it for a long time. Dashboard, it took forever to get rid of dashboard widgets, for example, like that whole, and put them on the side. It kind of replaced it with something a little neater, but whereas if we look at Windows today, if you looked back at Windows 95, 98, same thing. It's amazing how much of that DNA is still recognizably part of Windows today. But Microsoft took a huge detour trying to go somewhere else, failed, and came back. Their whole Windows 8 thing and stuff, they were just like, but really, you want to be in this convertible touch tablet mode with like these boxes that showed things, and it looked like Windows Phone, which they ultimately gave up on, and all this. They made this huge push to put all these resources into all these APIs and all this other stuff to get people to use their computers this way. Everyone just wanted to be on their desktop with their taskbar and their start menu. And they ultimately kind of gave up and went all the way back to that.
Yeah. Well, one thing that's kind of changed since the original Mac OS X is the whole kind of skeuomorphism.
Yes.
The whole skeuomorphic look.
Yeah.
So
I mean, that's true of the
iPhone and everything too. Yeah, that's just.
Yeah.
But even within that, they kept that before that there was this sort of age where everything had to be 3D. Everything looked like jewels. The buttons looked like little rounded jewels and stuff, and that was really hard to see. And everything had a shadow that was really obvious and stuff. So we've gone through these phases, but those have been like skins on top of the same user experience.
Right. The core experience hasn't changed much. The UI goes through trends just like everything else, but the core experience hasn't.
If Apple deserves credit for anything, it has been, maybe too much so, deciding that the Mac is going to work like the Mac. Like they have not taken very many risks with the way the Mac works. It's amazing how up in arms people get about something like a control center change or something like that. but they're really very cautious with it to the degree that they're not even doing touchscreens. They're just like, no, we have touchscreen devices. It's not going to be the Mac.
Yeah.
Whereas you see a lot more experimentation on the Windows side of things and Linux-based computers and stuff like that, in part because you have to. Like, there's so many brands vying for attention. They want to differentiate themselves. They're trying all this stuff. Most of it doesn't land. Most of it is just kind of ends up being a waste of time, and people come back to the workhorse stuff that they know and love, the way a multi-window layered interface with a taskbar and stuff like that. So,
one aspect of Mac OS X that kind of speaks to its versatility is that it's basically the core of every other Apple operating system. It's the core of iOS. It's the core of iPad OS. It's that Unix base has proved to be very versatile for Apple.
That's a big moment.
It's got a long way.
7 years later, in the iPhone introduction, Steve Jobs does his whole thing. It's a widescreen iPod. It's a blah blah, and then at the end he goes, and it runs OS X, and the big thing comes down. Like it's not just, it didn't just set the Mac on a path. It's everything. I memean, back then, in 2000, there was no iPod. Apple didn't sell anything other than a Mac. That was it.
Yeah.
When OS X was unveiled, that's all they had. And then the iPod came, and then the iPhone came, and then the iPad came, and then AirPods, and everything. But like, this was the moment. This was the kind of the germination of all of what we know Apple to be. today.
The longevity of operating systems that were released around the turn of the century like that has been really impressive. I mean, he talked about Mac OS 10 setting Apple up for this is the foundation for the next 10 years, right? And it's been 25.
It's been 25 years, yeah.
But part of what everybody did when Windows 95 and 98 were built, when Mac OS 10 was built, stuff like the change in computer science sort of going from operating systems before to operating systems then was making the foundational blocks about things like how files are accessed and stored and, everything else, the real down deep in the weeds stuff, all modular. Like, I don't think there's almost anything left of old Mac OS, literally, like in the bottom levels of the operating system, because it's all been torn out and replaced bit by bit, piece by piece, a very Ship of Theseus kind of thing. Like, how many planks do we remove before it's no longer the same ship? It's so it's like, yes, we're still using Mac OS 10 essentially after all these years, but are we? Like, how many pieces have been replaced by now, one at a time? Same with Windows. That's Windows Phone was built on the same Windows foundation that the Windows desktop stuff was built on, and they had tablet versions and stuff like that. Xbox OS is built on that and everything, but it's because they can tear out all the parts they don't need, make it really small and lean. They can replace the parts that need to work differently, So we could be with the same quote foundation from 25 years ago, could be with us for another 10 years easily. Like, I don't know that the need to sort of clean slate it again really exists the way it used to.
Yeah.
Well, maybe this is a question for you, Jason. Is there something that you can see that, like, so when we were using OS 9 in 1999,
yeah,
it was clear what was next. We didn't know what it looked like. We didn't, I'm not an engineer, so I didn't know, but I did know at some point very soon there's going to be a next step. Is that, like, so folding phones, VR, whatever you want to call it, like, is there an obvious next progression for the computer UI, really?
Not an obvious one. Like, I think everybody wants there to be one. I think companies like Meta, Apple does, and they want a bigger piece of it. They want Meta desperately wants VR to be it, and because they have no control over the foundational computer platforms of today. They tried to make a phone and failed. So they really want VR to be it, but like every time somebody says, like, this is going to be the future, and then people get their hands on it, it ends up kind of being a toy. Like, there's some stuff you can do with it, but you can't actually get more real productive work done in most fields more than you can on good old-fashioned flat screens with multiple windows and object-oriented programming and just object linking and embedding and just like the stuff that we have today. Like, so I think everybody wants there to be something better, but it seems more like what's going to happen is things are going to be used for special use cases to enhance productivity in those special use cases. So, like, you can imagine getting most of your work done with a Mac. Like, you're an engineer. You're not like a software engineer, like a hardware engineer, and you're working on an engine for a car or something, like designing it, work for Mazda or something, and you're working on the car, and you've got your CAD program open. You can see how you would put on a VR headset, be able to look in detail and explode the thing you're working on and look at the thing in 3D and rotate it to get a sense of perspective. But all of that's coming from a computer with a flat screen. And then you go back to your flat screen when you no longer need to see your 3D exploded view of your 3D model, and you need to start sending emails and doing all the other stuff that Yeah. So I think everything else is going to be still somewhat reliant on the central computer. I find it really interesting that there's a whole generation growing up so much with mobile devices that they do so much on their phones, and they're so limited. I see it all the time because they have the laptops are in their lives. They've done schoolwork, right? I mean, they have to do these things, but they prefer to do everything on their phones, and they're so completely constrained by what the platforms give them to be able to do. Like anytime you want to, I mean, they've resorted to like taking screenshots of text and sending them via whatever limited sharing situations they're allowed to send them to, because they can't like copy paste from this to that. You know, forget drag and drops. They're just, it's so constrained. It's so limiting. So I'm really kind of worried, if anything, that we're going to have a generation that grew up so much with mobile that they won't know what they could do with a desktop or laptop, like a full, what I would consider a more full operating system environment, you know?
Well, I mean, 10, 12 years ago, Steve Jobs said that the post-PC era had arrived, and with the iPad, and it really hasn't. I mean, everything that we do is still grounded. So my son is 13. He uses his iPhone all the time, iPad, but he has a laptop for school and he has a PC, you know, and he needs it. Like, he's realizing now that he's not 7, that, you know, like if I want to get something done, like I need something that's beyond that.
Yeah. The reliance on sort of mobile devices as a primary computing platform in a certain generation of people has turned them into people who just consume content and share the content they consume with somebody else, because that's all the software in these platforms permit you to do. Right. And then they and create more content for people to consume in exactly the ways, that exact same type of content in the exact same kind of ways. And I think it's kind of rough, right? And so, like you said, I think Steve Jobs was the one who said back in that post-PC era thing, like, you know, a laptop's like a truck. Sometimes you need a truck, but you don't drive a truck every day, right? Well, I think more and more, I hope people are starting to realize that trucks are pretty great.
Yeah, not even a truck. It's more like a sedan. That
honestly,
reliable and dependable and has all the things that you need. And sometimes you want to drive a coupe, and sometimes you want to drive something smaller. But for the most part, you know, give me the keys to the family car.
Well, we've also just, if we're gonna keep extending this thing, what we've seen is most people want a compact SUV. That's what sells, right? And so like the thin and light laptop is kind of that. I feel like Apple, if more than most companies, starts to give you the best, easiest, I should say, way to combine all that together. You've got your mobile life, you've got your laptop and stuff. It's all together without you having to do a bunch of stuff to make it all work together. I could just pop open my laptop and I can send texts and find and FaceTime calls, and all my photos are there, and you know.
I mean, it's still like the most mind-blowing thing I do on a semi-daily basis is I copy a link on my iPhone and I paste it on my Mac.
That is
one of the most underrated, super cool things that we can do.
I do that every single day. All the time. Something asks me to fill in my credit card information, and I'm just like, open the wallet, copy, paste it. And you can absolutely do that on Windows. It's not as seamless. It's not just automatic, right? Like, you've got to set up a phone thing, and you know, and then sometimes it doesn't work quite right. Sometimes you need a third-party app depending on what your phone is, and you know. But it does. All these things work, but Apple makes it easy.
That's, you know, to bring it back home, that the foundation of OS 10 from 25 years ago. Maybe they didn't. I don't know if Steve Jobs was that prescient where he saw all of it, but he knew like this, because he knew the iPod was coming. He knew they were working on a phone. He knew this foundation was going to bring this entire ecosystem that didn't exist yet into this, you know, this next generation world.
The thing that he and others, you know, Microsoft saw this too, that all the computer scientists of the time sort of understood was that we can't build this Gordian knot of stuff and just keep extending it. That software has to be designed to be more modular in more ways, so that it can be adapted to different use cases and form factors and inputs and all this other kind of stuff, but also and live longer, that the work they do can live longer. So we saw that with OS 10, we saw that with Windows, we saw that with, most of the Linux-based stuff. So many things have changed, but they changed by ripping out a piece and putting in a better piece.
So as Mike mentioned, Jason Snell wrote an article about what happened 25 years ago when Apple unveiled Mac OS 10. And he doesn't just recite history, but he offers some perspective about it now. Looking back 25 years ago.
Yeah, he was there. He was at the event. He covered it. He wrote about it. He followed the path through.
I think he said he was in the front row.
Front row.
Yeah.
Well, I would hope so.
Yeah. So we'll have a link to that article. Check it out in our show notes, and it's on our website at macworld.com. That does it for this episode of the Macworld Podcast, episode 916. Thanks to Jason Cross.
Thank you.
Thanks to Michael Simon.
Thank you, sir.
And thanks to you, the audience. Thank you for tuning in. You can subscribe to the Macworld Podcast in the podcast app, on Spotify, on YouTube at the Macworld Podcast channel, or through any other podcast app. Do you have any comments or questions? Send us an email at podcast@macworld.com or contact us through Blue Sky, Facebook, Threads, or X. Just search for Macworld and look for the blue mouse logo. Join us in the next episode of the Macworld Podcast as we talk about the latest in the world of Apple. See you next time.